Okay, so quick recap before we pick up where we left off, all right? We started by saying that this is a story of copying and translating. We haven't talked much about translating yet. We will be soon. That's our next thing, is to talk about the Latin Vulgate, which is going to be a translation. We've been talking about copying, right? Every ancient document was copied by hand because there was no other process than to copy by hand. Every ancient document has, therefore, mistakes in it, right? It's of necessity. You copy a whole written thing by hand, you're going to make some mistakes, some spelling errors, some words that get skipped, something that gets added because you're not paying attention. It's very common. We talked about the variants, right? That there are 400,000 variants in the New Testament. But then we talked about, well, what are the significance of those? Because only 1% of those affect the meaning. For example, and a common kind of variant error would be when Paul refers to Jesus, he would say, and to Jesus Christ our Lord. Okay, Jesus Christ our Lord. One variant might be if the person copying it just wrote Jesus Christ. Does that affect the meaning? Because if you read all of Paul, you're going to get the obvious impression that he believes that Jesus Christ is our Lord, right? That he is the Christ. All of those things go together. And so some copyists might add part of the title, might add Lord when Paul didn't originally put it, or might add Christ when he just said Jesus. Some might forget and leave it out. Those kind of variants don't affect the meaning, because whichever one it really is not the end of the world. We can figure that out. You get a lot of those kind of ones. We boiled that down and realized that about every 3 pages in the New Testament, there's an actual textual issue that affects the meaning and might be the right reading, right? And so those are usually at the bottom of any decent study Bible now that are going to tell you, or this, right? Some manuscripts say that. Late manuscripts say that. A few manuscripts say this. That's the kind of wording they usually use. We talked about that. Then we talked about our evidence, right? Talked about the 125 papyri that are from the first couple centuries. Talked about Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Alexandrinus, and Codex Ephraemi, the one that Constantine did, even though it was writing on top of writing. We talked about those, okay? And so that's the foundation of where we're at. We've got a lot of copies. We know about the textual issues and some of that need to be dealt with, and we're going to build on that. We're going to start. Copying is going to keep going on, right? We're in like the 400s. Copying is going to continue until the invention of the printing press. So that story will be going on in the background, but now we're going to shift a little bit and talk about translations and translation issues and work with that, okay? So let's pick it up with the Latin Vulgate. We're talking about 380 AD, and this is a direct translation from the Greek of the New Testament and the Hebrew of the Old Testament into Latin. Well, what is the purpose for that? If you know about the history of the Roman Empire, the eastern half of the Roman Empire has a much stronger Greek culture than the West. All right, remember Alexander the Great's empire went from Greece east, it didn't go west. Italy was never part of it, North Africa, Spain, they were never part of Alexander's empire. So they don't have as strong a Greek culture in those areas. So Latin is the more natural choice. And over time, the eastern and western halves of the empire are growing apart, so much so that they're going to actually literally be split into an eastern and western half of the empire. When the Western Empire falls, when Rome falls, the Eastern Empire is going to continue for about another 1,000 years. All right? So in the East, we will have Greek manuscripts being copied for the next 1,000 years. In the West, that's going to slowly come to a halt because we're going to be switching to Latin. All right? Jerome makes that translation. All right, one man making a translation. We're going to talk about that later on as well. Until we get to the King James Bible, we're normally talking about one man taking this whole effort upon himself. And so Jerome is going to do that. He's going to consult the Septuagint for the Old Testament, that Greek translation, but he's making his translation directly from the original languages. This is the best way to do it, right? From Greek to Latin, from Hebrew to Latin. You're just going one step, and that's what we want, right? We don't want from Greek to Latin to French to English kind of thing, right? Because every step of the way you have a chance of not having the right meaning. And so we're doing just one step. That's an example of what it looked like, of course, and the characters look familiar, right? Those are letters like our letters, but unless you took Latin in school and you actually remember it, that's not going to mean much to you. It is the text of the Western Church until the Reformation. So from this point in the story, in 380 until the Reformation, everybody in the West is reading Jerome's Vulgate. That's a pretty significant amount of success, right? Now, it is the first one as well to say that the Apocrypha is separate. All right, Jerome isn't mixing it in with the Old Testament text. He's setting it aside. He still translated it. It's still being copied in Latin, but it's not given that same authority. And there was a question asked before we started about the canon. How did they decide what books were in, what books were out? I wish I had the time to go into that, but that would take several hours to explain in and of itself. It's a whole nother story. But certainly there are some great books about that I could recommend if you want it. So there is the beginning of the story. This is an example of the kind of thing that we're going to start seeing in the West. This is the life-sized, this is Codex Amiatinus. It is a 13-inch by 19-inch by 7 inches thick, handmade, of course they're all handmade, copy of the Latin Vulgate Bible. This is from 716 AD. This weighed 75 pounds. This is when books were books, all right? This is a serious paperweight. 75 pounds. This was actually made by monks in England. They had 2 monasteries there, and they made 3 copies, one for each monastery. And then one of the monks from the monastery said, I'm going to take this 3rd copy that we made to the Pope in Rome. Well, carrying a 75-pound book all the way to Rome from England is a long journey. He didn't make it. He died. And what happened to the copy, nobody knew. It was actually ended up in a monastery in Tuscany, and for 1,000 years, nobody knew it was there. It was not until the modern era that they realized that's that one that those monks in England made. But this is just a good example of this. All sorts of different sizes, right? Because nobody's got a standardized anything, but you can see that they had a way of making sure that the columns were nice and neat and the lines. If I did it by hand, it would be, some of us, you can't keep a straight line going without the lines. But they did a pretty good job. And this is the text of the Western Church for 1,000 years is going to be the Latin Vulgate. People are not going to be reading, by and large, the Greek or the Hebrew, because those languages are not going to be well known. Only a few scholars are going to know them. Regular folk, not regular folk, educated people in the West, right? Whether they're in England or in France or in Spain, the educated class all speaks and writes Latin. It's the language of astronomy, of medicine, of philosophy, of any learned thing is going to be Latin. And so that is a binding thing for the church in the West. In the East, we're still looking at Greek. All right, still making Greek copies, still going along those lines. All right, and so what's going to happen with the Latin Vulgate? When it first comes out, you know why they called it Vulgate? It sounds like a word because we still use this word. Sounds like the word vulgar. Because they said that Jerome had made a vulgar translation. In other words, it was in the language of the people. It was the way regular folk spoke. And that wasn't exactly popular with some people. That's a theme that we're going to see several times, is people saying, why are you translating it so that the blacksmith can read it, or the milkmaid? They don't matter. But Jerome did that. Interesting story, in North Africa, when they switched to using Jerome's translation during one of the services, and the reading was from the book of Jonah, about the plant that grows up to shade Jonah, right? And Jerome translated that into Latin using a different plant name. I mean, trying to figure out from Hebrew, right, what plant is this really, and what word in Latin is the right plant. When they read that aloud in the church, and it was a different word for the plant, a different kind of plant, the people actually literally rioted. They freaked out. All right, because they had been used to a different Latin translation that had a plant that they thought that's got to be the right one. All right, and so that just goes to show you that people have been freaking out about translation issues and about word choices for a long time. So if it's still happening today, that should not surprise us. They freaked out over the plant that shaded Jonah. Most of us are thinking, who cares, right? It provided shade. That's the whole point. I don't care what kind of plant it was. They freaked out. That was in the beginning. At first, it was like people were a little skeptical. But after a generation or two, they started to say, oh, this Jerome guy, this is a great translation. After 500 years, it was the greatest thing since sliced bread, right? 1,000 years after Jerome, people are thinking, why would you ever translate the Bible into anything else? Jerome's is the best ever. It becomes a sacred text in its translated form, to the point that when someone starts to say, well, what about a Bible in French? Or what about a Bible in English? Or what if we go back and look at the Greek directly? People got upset about that. All right? Because things, once they become a tradition, once they become an institution, then eventually people, accept that as the end all of the story. And that's the exact same thing we will also see repeated later. All right? A few other things just to show you, since nothing is going to happen. The next slide, I inadvertently flipped to it, but if you look at that real quick, and then we'll go back from it. Come on, clicker. The next slide is 1382. We went from, go back, 380 to 1382. That's 1,000 years. So there's not anything happening in the West except for new copies of Jerome's Latin being made. All right? Nobody is innovating or doing anything else. So what else are they doing instead? Now we get into the era of the illuminated Bibles, of the Bibles that look nice. This isn't actually a Bible. This is a graphic novel. All right? This is an early version of a graphic novel. Of course, it looks like the people are from the medieval period. They didn't know how people dressed a couple thousand years before. They just figured they looked like us. This is called the Morgan Crusader Bible. This is actually the life of David happening here. You see David the shepherd. And so that's one thing that they did was, of course, use pictures, right? Like in the stained glass windows, to tell the story. Another thing that happens and this one's even bigger, this is the Winchester Bible. This one's even more huge, but you can see the amazing art in the margins. All right, and these are different people, right? You got one person that goes through, or a couple people that copy the text, and then, of course, somebody who is an artist comes in later and puts all the color on there, puts the drawings. And you can imagine that these are not for the common people, right? You're not going to pay for a book like this if you're a blacksmith or a shepherd or a millwright or something. The only people that can afford a Bible like this are people that are aristocrats, rich people, because this is a huge investment. And so, let's see, is there anything particular about this particular one that we need to add to it? You can just see, huge, right? Big Bible. It's going to get more elaborate as we continue to look here. This one you might have heard of. This is just a cover page. It's not the actual text. This is what's called the Book of Kells. It's from Ireland. It's a national treasure in Ireland in that sense. About AD 800 this was made. And the artistry, the geometric designs on this cover page are so intricate that you can't even really see them without a magnifying glass. All right, so whoever this artist was took a tremendous amount of time to put into it. All right, there's no other developments being made. Everybody's just copying the Latin Vulgate. Nobody's tweaking it. Nobody's updating it, really. Nobody's translating it. So we're just talking about making the Bible more artistically beautiful. And the Book of Kells certainly is a great example of this. About 500,000 people go every year to Trinity College in Dublin to look at this thing because this is just one page. It's so amazingly beautiful, and the amount of time and money that went into that. Here's another one, and this one actually has a little bit of significance for us. This is the Lindisfarne Gospels. It was just the Gospels, but this is the first example that we have anywhere of any portion of the Bible in English, which is a big deal. Now, it's actually just a Latin text, but a monk later went in and put the Old English over the lines. Wrote it in between every line. He wrote a translation of the Old English for just the Gospels. This is not something that was mass-produced. There's just one copy of it, so it's not going to have a big impact on the story as a whole. A couple important things then. So it's the first part of the Bible in English. It's in Old English, the earliest translation that we're ever going to see. But it's not going to make a big impact, of course, when you have just one copy. All right? But that's another thing to keep an eye on. You notice how beautiful this kind of stuff is. Work that I would have never been able to do. I can't draw squat, and probably most of you can't either. But you can appreciate the artistry that grows into these things, or that goes into these, excuse me. Let me grab my second set of notes to make sure I'm not skipping anything. All right. Which brings us to John Wycliffe. There's a name you've heard of, right? John Wycliffe, because you probably have heard of Wycliffe Bible translators. They're still out there working, trying to get the Bible into every language on the planet. The Great Schism of 1054 is in the notes, and I did not have a slide for it. Let me just let you in on that. In 1054, the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Pope in Italy both excommunicated each other. All right? It wasn't the first time that the eastern half and the western half of the empire hadn't got along, but this was basically the end of it. All right? It's a crazy, complicated story. It was actually, because they're so far away and they're communicating by messengers and whatnot, but they weren't getting along, and that was it. From that point on, there's an Eastern church and a Western church, an Orthodox church and a Catholic church. Those are the two halves. In the East, we're still going with Greek in the services, Greek copies of the manuscript. In the West, of course, we've already for the last 500 years or more, actually, it's almost 800 years, been doing Latin. But that divide has never been healed, right? That divide still exists. That's 500 years before the Protestant Reformation. It wasn't primarily over theology per se. It was more along the lines of culture and attitudes about a variety of different things. But you have that split. And it further cements the fact that in the West, we're not looking at Greek. All right? Because now we've got another reason not to look at the Greek. And so everything is going to continue to be about the Latin. For our purposes, the next step in the story that's going to have significance is John Wycliffe in 1382. This is the first Bible in English. Now, these were, of course, made by hand. We haven't talked about the printing press yet. They're made by hand, but 250 copies still exist. So that tells you that 700 years ago, they made a good number of copies of this. All right? That tells you there was a significant demand, right? That there were plenty of English people who spoke English, this is, of course, Old English, with enough money that they were willing to commission one of these copies. Wycliffe is the one who makes the translation. It's written, in Middle English, and we'll talk about Old, Middle, and Modern English in just the next slide, so hold that thought. However, in 1401, Henry IV issued a decree against heretics that was aimed at the Lollards. And if you study the history of England, the Lollards were a reform-minded group in that era of English history that wanted the church to make some changes. And it was believed by the people at the top, people like Henry IV, that Wycliffe's translation was feeding that reform desire, was kind of anti-establishment. And so it gets caught up in that. And of course, the Lollards were making use of Wycliffe's Bible to advance their goals. And then in 1408, a ban was put forth by the Vatican, by the Pope, saying that nobody anywhere is making any translation into the vernacular, which would be, of course, the language of the people, in Spanish, in Spain, in French, in France, etc. Nobody is going to do that without express permission, without oversight, without our hand in it. Now, you can look at that one of two ways, right? You can look at that as government getting in the way of the Bible being in the language of the people, or you can say that's the church trying to be responsible to make sure that when a translation is made, it's done right. And which answer you come down on probably has more to do with what you think of the papacy than the actual history of the thing, because it was probably more than a little bit of both. All right? By this time, you should not be surprised to know that the priestly class, the educated class, considered it their right to read and understand and interpret the Bible and didn't really think that regular folk had any need. Why would they want to read? We will tell them what it means. All right? It's not an egalitarian society, right? It's an aristocratic society where people are born to their place in society. And so you would not expect someone who is born the son of a duke, to care if someone who is a farmer is able to read the Bible for himself. To him, that's a meaningless thing. And I'll give you an example of that attitude in action. For a good part of the Middle Ages, it was not uncommon in some areas for the nobleman to be the only one, at least except for on perhaps special occasions, to take communion. He would take it on behalf of his people. All right, because they didn't really need to. He was the important one. You get that attitude is everywhere. All right, this is a stratified society, and so we're not expecting the people on top, to care or worry that the people on bottom can't have the Bible in a language they can understand. Plus, most of the non-aristocratic people are illiterate. Right? Nobody's going to school. And most of them don't have a need to read. They're just trying to get enough food in their children's bellies so that they don't starve, right? Just trying to survive the latest round of plague and the latest Viking raid and the latest whatever. They're not worried so much about this kind of thing. Wycliffe is opening a lot of eyes, though, all right? And let me read you a quote. This was a critic of Wycliffe, and I told you we'd see this attitude again. It hasn't gone anywhere. He said of Wycliffe that he translated the gospel that Christ gave to the clergy and doctors of the church so that by his means it has become vulgar. Same word, right? That they used against Jerome. And more open to laymen and women, that's probably the other one that made him mad, right? Who can read than it usually is to quite learned clergy of good intelligence. And so the pearl of the gospel is scattered abroad and trodden underfoot by swine. That was the attitude in the 14th century, that having regular folk read the Bible is just about as useful as throwing it to the pigs, because they're not educated. How could they possibly understand it and read it? All right? That makes us shocked, but that was not an out-of-place attitude back then. This is an example of one of Wycliffe's Bibles, of course. And they're going to be in all shapes and sizes, right? Because no two of them are going to be exactly alike. He's doing this work by himself, just like Jerome did. He did have help with the Old Testament. A man named Nicholas de Hereford translated most of the Old Testament. Now, Wycliffe is going to be doing his translation work directly from Jerome's Latin, because Wycliffe is not an expert in the Greek. He had de Hereford do the Old Testament because he didn't know Hebrew, but it's going to owe much to Jerome's Latin for a very good reason. It would be doubtful that Wycliffe could have been able to collect any Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. They're not in circulation at this time. There were some, of course, like Codex Vaticanus at Rome, and I'm sure there were some in important libraries here and there in collections. But for a regular guy, you could get a copy of Jerome's Latin. Getting a copy of a Greek manuscript is not going to be easy in the West at this time. If he'd wanted to travel to Constantinople, he could have found them easy, but that's certainly not what he did. As I said, they vary greatly in size and shape and all of that kind of thing. Can you read it? Unfortunately, not so much, right? But you're looking and you're thinking, there's got to be something here I can get, right? Let's work on it. If I told you where in the Bible this was, you might be able to find it. This is the start of the Gospel of John. Now can you see it? A little bit, right? In ye beginning, funky spelling, the spelling's not what we would expect, was ye word, and ye word was, I'm not sure what's going on with that. It's at God, and God was ye word. This was in, it sounds, I'm trying to avoid doing an accent. There's beginning at God. So, I mean, the words are there, but Middle English is rough. Middle English is the English of Chaucer. You ever read Canterbury Tales? Tried to anyway? It's rough, not easy to get through, all right? Very difficult, but it's English. All right? When did the English language first come to be? Not until after the Norman Conquest in 1066, right? Because English is an amalgamation of the Old Saxon and the Norman French, which is why English has the worst grammar rules of any language on the planet, because we've taken Saxon rules and French rules and thrown in, just to make it fun, some Danish rules from the Vikings, and made a real mess, which is why children have no idea how to end a word when we make it past tense or future tense, and there's no consistency in our spelling. There are silent letters that make no sense. So we did not have an English language of any kind until 300 years before this. There will not be another English translation for 150 years because the church has just outlawed it. All right? And so we made a big step forward, and now we've stopped. And we're kind of stuck here with the copies of Wycliffe, some of them being out there, but it being a difficult thing to get any new copies made. So let's talk a little bit about the English language, just so you understand what we're dealing with here. Old English is anything before 1066. That would be Beowulf. And if you've tried to read Beowulf, there's nothing there you're going to recognize. You have to take a class in Old English. My wife took a class in her master's degree in Old English so that she could read Beowulf. And most of you are thinking, why? But she thought it was cool. She likes Beowulf. The Lindisfarne Gospel, we told you that had that in the margins. That would be examples of Old English. Middle English would be Chaucer and Wycliffe, that era. Early modern English is what we're going to be moving to in just a few minutes. Early modern English would be Shakespeare, Tyndale, and the King James Bible would be great examples. We'll be soon talking quite a bit about Tyndale. You guys know Shakespeare, right? You've had encounters with Shakespeare. With some work, you can read that, right? Especially with the notes that tell you what those words you've never heard of mean at the bottom of the page, right? You love that addition because otherwise it's rough. That's early modern English. Anything from about 1650 to today is considered modern English. It's much more accessible to us, much easier for us to understand. You with me on that? Every language has this same thing. The Greek of today, if you go to Greece, they are not reading and writing and speaking the Greek of these manuscripts that we've been talking about. 2,000 years changes a language. All right? We see that in English in just a few hundred years. Now, most languages are a lot more codified today. They don't change as rapidly because of the things that with the printing press and the education system, that tends to freeze things and slow their change down. But they're still changing, aren't they? There are words that are being used today that don't mean what they meant when you were younger. What for better or for worse, right? I remember back in the day when bad became good as slang. And I don't know how that happened, but somehow it did, right? There's so many examples of that. Words and meanings and usage continue to change. No language is stuck in stone. Unless, of course, it's a dead language that we only have a copy on stone. That would be literal. But everything else continues to change. So let's continue with the next thing. Now, this is not part of our story directly, but it is going to have a huge impact on the development of the Bible in English. That would be the fall of the city of Constantinople, which you would know today by the name of Istanbul. Constantinople fell in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks. The Muslim armies, the Ottoman armies, had been trying to conquer Constantinople for hundreds of years. They had laid siege to it multiple times. The empire in the east has been shrinking for 700 years since the advent of Islam. They've had highs and lows. The Crusades have come and gone, right? And actually, the Fourth Crusade nearly destroyed Constantinople when the Crusader army, instead of going to the Holy Land, ended up in Constantinople, and they burned and pillaged and looted. It was a real mess. 1453, the city finally falls. It had the greatest, most expansive fortifications in the history of the world, which is why it never fell. It was bordered, as that drawing shows you, on 3 sides or more with water, which of course helps to defend it, right? And it had massive, huge, thick, tall walls. So how did the Turks take it? They brought along a little thing called cannon, a new invention, or at least new to the West. The Chinese had been toying with cannons for a long time. They just knocked the walls down, and it was over. All right, so for almost 1,400 years, we've had Greek manuscripts being copied in the eastern half of the empire, right? Especially in the last several hundred years in Constantinople, because the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, has been shrinking and shrinking, and at certain points they really only controlled Constantinople plus like the island of Rhodes and a few other islands. The Turks had conquered the western part of like Macedonia. They'd conquered what today is Turkey. They had everything except for the city. They just couldn't take the darn thing because of these walls until Canaan. It falls And in its wreckage, with the refugees, the people fleeing the city when they saw the handwriting is on the wall, they brought with them a ton of Greek manuscripts. Some of them, of course, from the 13th century or the 12th century. They're not that old. Some of them being treasures that are 1,000 years old, of course, right? They're bringing these manuscripts with them as they flee to the west. And suddenly, there is literally a flood of Greek New Testament manuscripts available for scholars in the West. In Italy, in France, in Spain, everywhere. Suddenly, people can once more look at the Bible, the New Testament, in its original language. And that's going to get people to ask the question, should we keep using Jerome's Latin translation, which is now 1,100 years oldish, or should we try to update it? Should we try to correct it? Should we go back to the Greek? Should we use the Greek to translate into the vernacular? All of these questions are going to be asked because of the availability of Greek manuscripts that are suddenly flooding the area. And they are all, as it says up there, Byzantine text type. Not all, but most of them are. They're copied from the copies that have been copied for 1,000 years in Byzantium, and so they don't read like the ones that were copied down in Alexandria or the ones that were copied in the West. They've got slightly different readings because of those variations, which will once again get scholars asking questions. Which Greek should we use then? From the Western style, from the Byzantine style, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of thought is going to be happening. People asking questions that have laid dormant for a long time. And that is, of course, the end of the eastern half of the empire. And virtually the end of the copying in the West. Now, this is 1453, and something else is going to happen not long after that that will literally change the world. That phrase gets overused, right? This is going to change the world. And oftentimes the world goes on like it did before, right? And you think second verse, same as the first. This change is one of the most important changes in the history of our species on this planet. And that would be the invention of the printing press. Johannes Gutenberg, in 1455, first printed the Latin Vulgate Bible. You're thinking, of course he did, because what else would you print? It was the obvious choice for Gutenberg once they'd figured out. A lot of people, just like with the Wright brothers in flight, right? They were the first ones to do it, but a lot of people were trying. A lot of people were trying to make a printing press that would work, right? That you could actually efficiently print things that would be better than handmade copies. But it was complicated. It was hard. It was a difficult invention. Gutenberg gets the credit because he's the first one that figured it out in a way that would be useful, cheap. And the first thing he printed was the Bible, beginning in 1455. We have 47 copies of these that have remained. All right? But they had a huge demand. All right? This is still the Latin Vulgate. He's not in the translation business. He's just a printer. All right? He's just in this, it's his job. All right? Notice the statistics at the bottom, and we'll look more at the Gutenberg Bible in just a minute. I'll show you a life-size copy. All of this is added by an artist later, right? All of this color. He's just printing in black and white. Actually, at the very beginning, Gutenberg tried doing what more or less like a red letter edition, black, and then reprinting it with red. And after a couple of copies, he's like, this is ridiculous. This is slower. And they actually just added red. As you can see, there's a little bit of red here and a little bit of red there. They did that by hand. Said that was cheaper than trying to reprint the whole thing with a different color. All right, so he printed in black and white, and then, of course, if you had the money and you were an important person, you would have an artist add fancy stuff later. This obviously didn't come from the printing press here. That's 1455. By 1500, less than 50 years later, printing presses in 17 different countries. 260 towns in 45 years have their own printing press. 1,120 printing offices. In 45 years, 1,100 people were doing what Gutenberg was doing. Printing stuff. Does that tell you there was a big demand? That people really wanted printed materials? Because it was so much cheaper and quicker and easier. They printed 40,000 different things in 45 years. The Bible was just the tip of the iceberg, of course. Texts on botany, texts on astronomy, on medicine, on philosophy, all sorts of things. And then it wasn't long, of course, before people understood political tracts, right? That didn't take long before those kind of things started being pasted on walls. But all sorts of stuff that people had, that there was a pent-up demand for this stuff, that people that could copy legibly were never going to be able to meet that demand. The supply always was less than the demand until the printing press. And how much did they print? 10 million copies of things in 45 years. They printed more in 45 years than all of the hand copies in all of the languages in the history of the world. Okay? Just let that sink in for a minute. So everybody that ever copied by hand over 1,500 or so years produced less than these 1,100 printing presses in 17 European countries in just 45 years. That is changing the world. For better or for worse, mostly for better, because now ideas are flowing much faster. And this is where we get the start of the Industrial Revolution and the Scientific Revolution, because now people can learn quicker, and we can make more discoveries about medicine and all sorts of stuff. All right? Shakespeare wouldn't be Shakespeare without the printing press. To make his copies more widely known, they would never have reached their popularity, et cetera, et cetera. So the printing press, I almost... I don't want to belabor the point, but maybe I am already. So this is an example of a Gutenberg Bible. This is one page from a Gutenberg, not an actual page, just a facsimile of a page. Gutenberg's Bible had 1,282 pages in 2 volumes, because 1,282 pages is a really thick book, right, for the binding. 2 volumes. They also, on paper, they also printed on vellum, which is animal skin, which is much more expensive, much more beautiful thing to print on, in 4 volumes. The paper version weighed 30 pounds. The vellum version weighed 50 pounds. As you can see, their paper is not as thin as our paper today, right? Because my Bible's got about the same number of pages, but it doesn't weigh 30 pounds. I can tell you that. They're actually very, very thin pages that we use these days. 48 of them are still in existence. Only 21 of them are complete. So there's the Gutenberg Bible, and that's going to make things pick up the pace. Things are going to go much faster in the history of the Bible from this point forward, because every change, every development, every invention is going to go much, much faster to a much bigger audience, right? Because now more people can afford books. And we're going to have the invention of the thing called the book fair. In the late Middle Ages, the book fair was an amazing thing. People would come from miles around to see what books could be bought. And a fascinating thing happened later on. You would have in the book fair the works of John Calvin, about this much, and at the other end of the book fair you would have the works of Arminius. These great theological guys arguing with each other. You could buy one guy's books or you could buy the other guy's books. Which books do you want? And so that kind of thing is going to be available. We're not quite to the English part of the story that you're going to be able to read, but we will be there very quickly. And here comes one of the biggest changes, one of the most important changes for the development of the Bible from the ancient world to the modern, and that would be the work of the man named Desiderius Erasmus. People usually just call him Erasmus because that's easier. In 1516, so about 55 years after the invention of the printing press, Erasmus, who is a priest, a scholar from the Netherlands, he is going to he's going to collate and publish a Greek New Testament. Now, if you look at what's on the screen, this is the same thing, but that's easier to see. This over here is Jerome's Latin. And he starts with Jerome, doesn't want to diss Jerome because that could be hard on you. And on the left is his edited Greek edition. And what do I mean by edited? What Erasmus did was go try to find as many Greek manuscripts as he could. We don't know exactly how many, but he got somewhere around 6 or 7 of them. Most of the ones that he had were relatively recent. They weren't like Codex Sinaiticus or Vaticanus. They weren't 1,000 years old. They were 50 years old or 200 years old. They were relatively new, probably, and for the most part, they were from Byzantium, right? Part of that flood that came from the fall of Constantinople. He got 6 or so of them together, and he collated them. What do I mean by that? He set them out in front of him, and every time there was a variance, right? Every time they came to a spot where those 6 didn't agree, he decided what the right reading should be. What do we call that? That's textual criticism. It's not a bad word. It's not being critical. It means that you're looking with a critical eye at the evidence and making a decision. Now, he could have simply said, I'll take this manuscript and print that one, right? Pick one at random, and I don't have to think it through. I can just print whatever this one's got. He didn't do that. He took the time and put in the effort to compare them and try to figure out what the right reading was in every place. All right? He did the exact same thing that modern scholars are doing every time they put together a new edition of the Greek text. All right? What he did was no different. The only difference being that he had less evidence to work with and he was just one man. Nowadays, it's all a team. It's never just one man. So Desiderius Erasmus put this effort in. He put together a printed Greek edition using what he thought the correct readings were from the ones that he had. In a few places, none of his 6 manuscripts had the text that he wanted, especially in Revelation. He didn't have very good manuscripts of the book of Revelation. And so a couple times, he actually translated back from Jerome's Latin into what the Greek would have been if it went from the Latin to the Greek. So a couple times, he came up with a reading in his printed edition that had never existed before. So what you get from Erasmus is something brand new. It's not a simple copy of one of those manuscripts. It's a edited, collated edition, a printed edition. And this is what we're going to see from this moment forward. All right? Nobody anymore is going to be simply making copies of one manuscript just like it reads, right? You're not just simply copying it down by hand, looking back and forth and copying it. If you're going to make an edition, it's going to be a printed edition, and therefore you're going to take the time to figure out what it should be. I want to make sure that sinks in because that's an important development. And what we've been doing, what scholars have been doing and experts have been doing for the last 500 years, it really hasn't changed anything. So this is not a manuscript. We are at the end of the era of manuscripts. When I say 5,780 manuscripts, right, when we gave that number, that ends with the printing press because printed editions are not counted. All right, only the hand-copied editions. Erasmus is a printed edition. So what did he want to do with this? Look, well, a couple other bits of details. This is a life size. It's actually the same page. I don't know how I ended up with the same pages a few times, but this is the same page. As I told you before, sometimes he had to go from Latin back to Greek for a few spots that were missing, which is kind of funky. All right. One other thing about Erasmus, because this is going to have a huge impact. We're going to be coming back and talking about this several times. One other thing about this is that he had to rush to the printing press. He had to get it done quickly because there was competition. Because he had heard that a team was trying to put together a Greek New Testament, and he wanted to get to press before they did. All right? This is the start of people trying to rush to press. And so his first edition, he knew, had errors in it. And he's going to come back and print another edition a couple years later, and then another edition, and then another edition, and each time weed out the errors that his haste and his lack of manuscripts had put into it. All right? So we will get multiple editions of Erasmus. Let me see if there's anything that we want to... So the basis, this will become the basis of Luther's German translation, which is a huge step in the history of the German language and the German country. This will be the basis of Tyndale's English translation, which is where we're going next, and by extension, the basis of the King James Bible. The King James Bible is based in the New Testament upon Erasmus. Basically, what they're going to do is put all of the editions of Erasmus in front of them and work off of that. All right? So his manuscripts that he was able to collate, he was able to get, are their manuscripts. They're the same ones because they're going off of his printed editions. He was going off of the half dozen he had available to him. For what he had available, he did a great job. Nobody is criticizing Erasmus for being dumb or sloppy or biased. The only thing anyone later on is going to say is, we wish there had been more evidence, right? That he had more of those manuscripts in front of him than just 6 or 7. Because there are, of course, thousands of them. And that would have made a much bigger job, but that would have made it more accurate. As I said, they made corrections later. Robert Stephanus took over afterwards and published another text in 1546, along with Theodore Beza, who succeeded John Calvin in Geneva. Also. And so there ends up being 5 major editions of this Greek New Testament based on the work that Erasmus began. Okay, and now we will find out why Erasmus had to hurry to the press. No, we won't. I got one more slide. So the word Textus Receptus, that you might have heard that before. If you've ever talked to a King James only person, the word Textus Receptus will be in the conversation at some point. The Textus Receptus is simply just the Latin name of, it means received text, but it is simply the printed editions of Erasmus. That is all that it means. There's a lot of words on there. You don't need to try to, it looks like you are trying to read it, but it says a lot of what I already said. It's Erasmus's half dozen manuscripts in their printed form. All right? So if somebody tells you that the Textus Receptus is an ancient manuscript, they already have told you they don't know what they're talking about. It didn't exist until Erasmus collated it and edited it and printed it. After the King James Bible, they will print the Greek edition that was what the King James translators chose, right? They're going to make some choices, and the Greek words that they said were right will later be printed as the Textus Receptus. It is not a manuscript, it is a printed edition. There's nothing wrong with that, but it is no older than the 15th century, or the 16th century. Because that's when it first came to be, all right? And so we need to, and if we're going to understand these issues correctly, we need to have truth in all the details, right? And I just want to make sure that that's clear, when people talk about the Textus Receptus. It's not some ancient thing. It is simply just the printed edition of Erasmus, more or less. We'll move on from there. All right. Why is he hurrying? Well, why he's hurrying is that this monstrosity, this monster, this amazing thing was about to be printed in Spain. And this is called the Complutensian Polyglot, which is a huge, massive name. Complutensian is just the Latin for the university where this work was done. This is a life-size edition, or the right size of it. And you're thinking, look at all those columns. What on earth is this thing? Let me lay this out. This is the work of Cardinal Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros. That's a name, probably why you've never heard of him, because Erasmus is a little bit easier to get out, right? Cisneros was a cardinal, worked at the university in Spain, and he got together a team of scholars. And he said, we need to put out something that will help theologians and students of the Bible, help them understand better the original languages so that they can do a better job. This is an aid for people that want to study the Bible in the original languages. All right? And for its era, this is an amazing thing. I will tell you all the things that it has in it. Starting with the middle. See the middle column? That is Jerome's Latin. Right down the middle, okay? So they put Jerome's Latin in. This happens to be from the Old Testament, but Jerome's Latin would have been for the Old Testament and the New Testament. On the right, we have, I think this one's reversed for some reason. It's a mirror image. On mine, it's the right. Here, it's the left. This is the Hebrew. What do you know about Hebrew and how it's written? Right to left. Screwy, right? Backwards, as it were. So you can't do an interlinear with Hebrew, can you? Because the word order is backwards. It reads that way, reread this way. That wouldn't work. So what they did was actually ingenious. They put little, and they're hard to see on here, but they put little letters above each Hebrew word and put the same letter above the Latin word, so that you could go from every Hebrew word to the Latin word if you needed help with the Hebrew, right? You look at that Hebrew word, you're not sure about what it means, you look and say, oh, it's that word in Latin. Okay, I know what that is, and that helps you out. They made it an interlinear without being able to really make it an interlinear because, it's Hebrew. You can buy an interlinear Greek, right? They're not hard to find, where the words are just right over each other. It's not a problem. It doesn't work in Hebrew because it's right to left. So they figured that out. On the other side, you have, I got to make sure I get them all correct, is the Greek of the same text. So we've got the Latin, we've got the Hebrew, and since this is the Old Testament, that would be the Septuagint, the Greek translation from the 2nd century BC. What an amazing tool for a preacher, for a pastor, for a priest, to be able to, in the Old Testament, say, here's the Hebrew, here's the Latin, here's the Greek. Right? That's going to help me understand what's going on here as I try to remember that if you're going to be preaching in Latin perhaps, or trying to put your sermon into the vernacular, if you don't have a vernacular translation yet, which most did not, you've got to do that work yourself. So it's going to help you tremendously to have all of these aids. But they had two other things at least in the Pentateuch, which is what this page is from. On the bottom, we also have a Targum, and we haven't talked about that much. That is rabbinic commentary. This one's actually in Aramaic with the Hebrew characters, but it's a commentary on what the text meant, an ancient commentary. And also on the bottom, we have a literal Latin translation, as opposed to a regular kind of translation. So you've got 5 different things on one page to help you, plus notes in the margin. These are the root words for the Hebrew. What's the root verb, right? So that you can help, and it helps in Hebrew because remembering what they are is not easy. You've got that as well. All of this, think this through, being typeset by hand for every single page. So that amounted to 5 different text blocks, 4 different typefaces, right? Because you can't use the same typefaces for Latin and Hebrew and Greek. The letters are different. 4 different typefaces, Latin, Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic, with the interlinear little doohickeys everywhere in the Latin and in the Hebrew, and cross-references for the Latin and Hebrew words. They did all of that work to make 600 copies of this thing. The guys at this printing press deserve some sort of gold medal, because that is an amazing amount of work for every single page. 1 page at a time. Then you make 600 copies, then you take it apart, and then you spend who knows how much time getting all of that ready for the next page. Yeesh, right? Most of us couldn't be bothered to do this kind of work. This is serious work. And Erasmus wanted to make sure that he got the press first. Why? Because this is awesome. All right? If this was widely available, who would buy Erasmus's? Erasmus's was great, but it was just the Latin and the Greek. Come on, man. Right? And he was just one man. He was never going to do this kind of work by himself. This took a team of scholars, and it took them a long time. They began in 1502. It took them 15 years to do it. It took them 12 years to have the New Testament ready. But when the New Testament was ready, they couldn't publish it because they wanted to wait for the Old Testament so they could publish it all together. Then they had to wait for the Pope to approve it. They had to send their copy to Rome. That's going to take a while, right? To go page by page and check the whole thing. However many scholars the Pope was able to spare to work on this, it's going to take months, if not more. And then something awesome happened. They had to wait for the exclusive deal that Erasmus had made with the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian. He had exclusive rights for 4 years to print the Bible in Greek throughout the Holy Roman Empire, which of course included Spain. They had to sit on it. They couldn't publish this thing because Erasmus beat him to it, which is just an awesome part of the story. You don't think about these things happening way back in the 16th century, but they were. Cardinal Jimenez died before this thing got published. He didn't live long enough to see this work that he began, actually get to the printed press. But it was an amazing tool. We've got the Latin, the Hebrew, the Greek, the Aramaic Targum, the literal. Holy cow. All right? 123 of these copies, these 600 still exist. Now, this is not going to have the impact on the English Bible that Erasmus did. All right, because Erasmus is a much cheaper thing to print, right? Much more accessible. Many, many more copies of Erasmus's work are going to be made than the 600 were made of this thing. All right, great for scholars, useful, and an amazing amount of work. I would bring it up in this story simply to show you how much love some of these men had for the Word of God, right? This is not a financially successful labor. All right? They lost money on this thing. You don't make money bringing a team of guys together for 15 years off of 600 copies. All right? Actually, it was Cardinal Jimenez that put a lot of the money into this. If you understand, right? Cardinals and whatnot and bishops were all aristocrats back then, right? They were the second and third and fourth sons of an earl and a duke. They didn't have anything else to do except for to join the church. So his family had money, but he put a lot into this thing because they thought it was important, because they loved the Word of God. And it's a pretty amazing thing. So if you get a chance later, take a closer look at that, because just the minutiae, the details of this work are pretty amazing. And we're right about where I wanted to be at this point, so that's great. All right. One more step in the side direction before we get to English. I promise you the next slide will be in something that you can read. It will look like English. But we can't skip Martin Luther. All right? For one reason, it's 2017, isn't it? So 1517 to 2017, it's 500 years this year. This October is the 500th year of the start of the Protestant Reformation. Big anniversary. So let's talk about Martin Luther for a few minutes. Martin Luther wrote his German New Testament in 1522. He translated it. He did it in 6 months, which is actually 10 months, completed in 10 months. He did this work by himself, and he worked fast. Of course, at the time, he was hiding because the Holy Roman Emperor had put a bounty on his head, more or less, and he was being protected by one of those German princes that were always making the Holy Roman Emperor upset by not listening and doing what they were told. There's an uncomfortable amount of politics in the Protestant Reformation that some of us probably don't want to talk about. The Protestant Reformation would not have happened if the German princes had not wanted to thumb their nose at the Holy Roman Emperor. That's true. If they had been good little princelings and done what they were told, they would have squashed Martin Luther. They would have turned him over, and he probably would have ended up just like Jan Hus, burned at the stake. But they kept him safe because they had their own priorities and prerogatives, and they saw a chance to weaken their feudal overlord in a way that they didn't mind. And that's a side effect. History sometimes happens that way. All right, so what did Martin Luther do that's pretty important here? One thing that he did was to translate the New Testament into German in the language of the common people. We've heard that before, right? Guess what? I got a quote from somebody who thought that was a bad idea. You've heard this before. There's someone who said that Luther's New Testament was so much multiplied and spread by printers that even tailors and shoemakers, and here it comes, yea, even women and ignorant persons. Don't you love how this guy put women and ignorant persons in the same thing? What a lovely man. Who had accepted this new Lutheran gospel and could read a little German, studied it with the greatest avidity as the fountain of all truth. Some committed it to memory and carried it about their bosom. And so that critic said, no, don't translate it into the language of the common people, because then the tailors and the shoemakers and those women can read it. All right, that's not what they wanted. But it was the language of the common people, which for German was an undertaking. If you know anything about German, German had strong dialects. German that was spoken on the Baltic coast was almost incomprehensible to Bavarian German before this. They couldn't understand each other. It was that much. It's not just like, Yankee and Southern drawl. It was different words, different pronunciation. He went out into the marketplace and listened to the people bargaining for food, and whatnot, heard the words that were currently being used by regular people. And those were the words he used when he translated the Bible into German. So it was a huge decision to make it in the language of the common people so that regular folk, like that critic didn't like, could just read it. Just pick the thing up and read it without having to have a college education. It was based on Erasmus's Greek New Testament, which will later be published as the Textus Receptus for clarification. So Martin Luther does that. This is a life-size of Martin Luther's. As I said, he left the copy to the castle to go listen to regular folk. It was significant in the success of the Reformation because it got the Bible into the hands of the people. And this, of course, predates the same thing happening in English because we're talking about him first, right? We're going chronologically. This also brought the German language into the modern era and made it one language, because all over the country people were reading Luther's German, and that influenced the language and brought it together. You would not have had a unified Germany without a unified German language, and that wouldn't have happened without Martin Luther. So for better or worse, a united Germany owes a huge debt to Martin Luther. People that fought in World War I and World War II might not be big fans of that because that didn't always work out well for the world. But Martin Luther's work there ends up being huge. Now, it also becomes tangential because the next person that we're going to talk about is going to be largely influenced by the work of Martin Luther, and that is William Tyndale. William Tyndale is probably the most important person in our whole story when we're talking about the Bible in English. Nobody is going to have a bigger impact. Now, obviously, you could say, well, Erasmus's impact is huge because without the Greek, what would they have to translate from? But in terms of the Bible in English, the Bible we have today, no matter what translation you're reading, it has more of William Tyndale's fingerprints on it than anyone else. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about William Tyndale, and I promise you, you will be able to read some of the things. I will zoom in and show you some passages, and you'll be like, oh, I can read it. It sounds like what I know. It'll be glorious for you. So in 1526, William Tyndale publishes his English New Testament. It is the very first mass-produced English Bible. Now, of course, Wycliffe was first, but they were copying by hand. How many copies can they make? Now we've got a printing press. We can churn these things out. Boom, boom, boom. More and more and more copies. At least in theory, there's going to be a hang-up to this, but there's going to be a lot of Tyndale's New Testaments made. He based it on the New Testament on Erasmus's Greek, all right, like we expect. He also looked at the Latin New Testament. He looked at Luther's German because Tyndale was fluent in German. And so he said, well, let me see what Luther did, right? Might as well check and see if that helps me decide what English word to use. And then also on Jerome's Vulgate. So what did he do? He used everything that he had available. Latin, Greek, German, whatever. Anything he could get his hands on, he used it as the basis of this translation. That's pretty smart, right? He didn't just say, no, I'm only going to look at one. I don't care what this other stuff is. He looked at everything and used that in order to make his New Testament translation. We're not entirely sure what sources he used for the Old Testament, in part because his story gets really muddled by the history that's happening behind it. The New Testament was finished, and half of the Old Testament was finished when he was killed, when he was martyred in 1536. That's why the story gets a little bit difficult. He was not allowed to publish his Bible in England. Remember, we said that they had made it illegal to make a translation without permission. William Tyndale did not have permission. So his publication was illegal, and he couldn't do it in England. All right, the government would have shut him down, and so they went to the continent. They went to Worms and published it there, and then also had to keep fleeing. In the end, William Tyndale will be betrayed by a friend, by someone who had become his friend, is going to sell him out and turn him in. All right, it's not a good story, and we'll continue with it here in just a second. But let's talk about its impact. It will heavily, and heavily is almost too small of a word, heavily influence every single subsequent English translation, just about. All right, about the only, well, no, actually, I was going to say except for perhaps Douay-Rheims, but it even had an impact on them. It was the basis of the Great Bible. We'll talk about that one soon. And that one was authorized. So his was illegal, but when the next one comes out that is actually legal, it's basically going to be what Tyndale did. So much so that 1/3 of the King James Bible, depending on how you count this stuff, at least 1/3 of it is word for word Tyndale. So when you pick up your King James Bible and you read it, you're actually getting about 1/3 of it from the 1526 Tyndale. It's even older than 1611. His influence cannot be overstated. So let's look at what we got. This is And you know that the old S's look like F's, right? It's weird. The Gospel of St. John, the first chapter. You with me? Can you see it? Can you read that? And what's with beginning, right? Can we standardize the spelling of beginning? Man, that's just almost as bad as Wycliffe, right? In the beginning was that Word, and that Word was with God, and God was that Word. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by it, and without it was made no thing that made was. That last phrase is a little off, but that sounds familiar, doesn't it? It's English, right? It's not modern English, because we told you that this is the early modern English, but it's not bad. We can follow that. We can understand that. We can still read it. There's going to be some archaic words in there that we picked the start of the Gospel of John because most of us have that at least memorized, right? It's in our head somewhere. It sounds real familiar. So you got that. What else do we need to know about Tyndale? So, here's my Tyndale. This is one of the editions. What would we call a Bible this size? Pocket-sized. Why would you make a Bible pocket-sized? When it's illegal. You don't want a 75-pound version of an illegal book, right? Kind of hard to smuggle that. Kind of hard to hide that. All right? So they made smaller ones. The smaller editions are cheaper, right? And so this was able to be printed in greater numbers than that. Let me throw some phrases at you that Tyndale came up with that you probably recognize from the King James and even some of the other modern translations. Tyndale was the one that came up with these phrases: give up the ghost, the salt of the earth, fight the good fight. I've got more of them up there. Blessed are the poor in spirit. I am the good shepherd. Blessed are the peacemakers. He's the one that came up with all those phrases that we like so much. It's all Tyndale. You can't understate the importance of Tyndale. Yep, I already said that. No single person has had a greater impact on the Bible in English than Tyndale. So let me just compare the King James with Tyndale so you can see what I mean. I told you it was mostly Tyndale, right? Oops, I got to go back because I am not on John 1:1 anymore. So look at John 1:1, and I will read you the King James, and you tell me where we've got a difference, if you notice any. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. Close, right? Pretty darn close. We could do the same thing in Ephesians, and it's on the next page after this. I will, in a minute, we'll look at Ephesians 2:8 and 9. Ephesians 2:8 and 9, you know, right? You got that one memorized? That's a pretty common verse. And we'll look at it in Tyndale and the King James, and you'll see how close they are. The last thing that Tyndale said, and this was attested by a variety of sources, so we really think he did say this. It's not likely that Martin Luther ever said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." That's really pithy and really awesome, and it would be great in a movie, but he probably didn't say that. Tyndale said this. The last thing he said as they were burning him at the stake was, "Lord, open the eyes of the King of England." What did he want the King of England to do? Change the law. Make it so that it was possible to put the Bible in English legally, to print it there in England. All right? And this was in 1536. Before that, copies of Tyndale's Bible were confiscated and burned publicly when they were found. They were literally smuggling them in like they were cocaine. You know, hiding them under things and false walls in boxes and all that stuff. I'm sure the same tricks that drug dealers use today to sneak in drugs, they were using to sneak the Bible into England. He was condemned as a heretic while he was in exile in Antwerp by the Holy Roman Emperor. The Netherlands were still part of the Holy Roman Empire. They had that big, long fight for independence with Spain. Charles V was the Holy Roman Emperor, and he was betrayed by a friend, and they strangled him to death and burned him at the stake. Let's hope for his sake that they strangled him first, right? So that it was just his body being burned. That was in 1536. Remember that date. Who was the Holy Roman Emperor? He was Charles V. He was the Habsburg King of Spain. His aunt, you ought to know this name, was Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon. Oh, yeah. She was the first wife of Henry VIII, King of England. And what did he do to her? Tossed her out on her keister. No, he didn't have her executed because her nephew was the Holy Roman Emperor. Let's not get crazy. But he divorced her because she couldn't have a son. She actually had miscarriages and children that died in infancy. It's very tragic. And so when Thomas Cromwell, who is the ancestor of Oliver Cromwell from that period when the Puritans were running England, his ancestor Thomas Cromwell went to Charles V and said, please let William Tyndale go, right? We'll take care of him. He'll be punished, but don't kill the man. Charles V said, right, yeah, because I really want to do Henry VIII a favor. After he just tossed my aunt out on her keister and took England out of the church and formed the Church of England so that he could have a divorce and make himself the head of the Church of England so that he could sign the paper that said he could have a divorce. All right? So basically, Henry VIII got Tyndale killed because he was a jerk. Long story short, Henry VIII was a jerk. I mean, in more ways than one. That's a polite term. So let's, just in 1 minute, we'll look at Ephesians. So what did Tyndale do that had such an impact? One of the things that he did was translate the word church as congregation. He translated the word priest as elder. He translated do penance as repent and charity as love. Those are choices, translators' choices in English. But they showed something very obvious, that William Tyndale was on the side of Martin Luther and the Reformers, right? When you start talking about the congregation instead of the church, all right? Protestant churches, most of them anyway, have a congregational polity where they are ruled, at least in part, in greater part, by the choices of the local congregation. That's making a political statement when you use that word instead of church. All right? So all of his translation choices are fine. Those are synonyms, right? But he's doing that with a bent, with a pro-Luther bent. And of course, he was a fan of Martin Luther. He had gone to Germany to see Martin Luther. He used Martin Luther's German New Testament to help him, which is one of the reasons why he was condemned as a heretic. All right? But this other thing that he did has a huge impact on translation ideas moving forward. He had this theory about translation. He said, when I look at a Greek word, we'll pick a Greek word, noun, verb, it doesn't matter. This is the Greek word. I do not have to translate that word by the same English word every single time. I can use the context. I can try to figure out what the author meant when he used that word, because sometimes what he meant is not the same thing in English as it would be in Greek, right? Because every word has what we call a sphere of meaning, right? Let me give you an example. The best example, the most obvious example is the word love. A lot of meaning in that word, right? In English. It can mean like. It can mean the emotion of love. It can have a sexual meaning. It can have a lot of meaning. Do we always have to use the word love? There are other words that are interconnected and related to it, right? Greek has 3 words in the New Testament that it uses that we often translate as love. Do we have to use love every time, right? And so he looked at that and he made the smarter choice of saying, I want the accurate meaning. My translation doesn't have to be wooden so that it always uses the exact same word. What he did is called functional equivalent. If you use the same word every time, it's called formal correspondence. Basically, formal correspondence would be to set a dictionary in front of you and say, here's every Greek word in the New Testament. Here are all of them. Give me the English word that is the equivalent, and then after that, we're not translating, we're just matching, right? What's the Greek word? There's the English word. What's the Greek word? There's the English word. We're not thinking anymore. You understand, right, that the words that Luke uses, he uses differently than the words that Paul is using? Who uses the same Greek words differently than John? They don't use the same words the same way because they were different people. You with me on that? Is that sinking in? Maybe you never thought about that before, but that's important, right? We want to read Paul for Paul and Matthew for Matthew and Luke for Luke. We don't want to put them in a stew and try to make them all the same because they had different things to teach us, all right? Especially in the Gospels, right? Each of the 4 Gospels is a portrait, a picture of Jesus. We don't want them to sound exactly the same because that's not what their authors were intending. Why would they have done so? If the theory that Mark was written first is true, then why would Matthew and Luke do what they did? They could have just said, oh, Mark already did it. They said, yes, but there's more of the story to tell. I want to emphasize this. I want to focus on that. And so their words are used somewhat differently. Okay, and so Tyndale did that and said it's not just this word is always this word. I want the meaning. The meaning is more important. And we use that to this day. All right, that's what people still do to this day, but Tyndale made it acceptable. Tyndale set the precedence. So let's look at Ephesians. I don't know, it starts right here. There's no numbers, right? We'll get to that. We're not there yet, but see it right there? For by grace are ye saved, right? You with me? You look at that. I will read the King James, and you tell me if we're on the same page. For by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus unto good works, which God hath before ordained that we should walk in them. How close? Darn close? Were there any words different? Barely? I mean, so that's telling you that Tyndale, boom, set the standard. All right? Tyndale is the guy that everybody else is working on. All right? It's the equivalent of, and let me show my geekdom here, of saying that nobody writes science or writes fantasy novels that doesn't owe a debt to J.R.R. Tolkien. He invented the genre. Nobody writes science fiction that doesn't owe a debt to Isaac Asimov. Or in the modern era to George Lucas, but please, Isaac Asimov first. Those two guys invented those genres. Nobody writes that doesn't owe them something. And that's the exact same thing with Tyndale. His writing is everything from here on out. All right? You with me? Maybe I hit Tyndale pretty darn hard, but and what was the date? 1536, right? When he said, "Open the eyes of the King of England." Look when Miles Coverdale's Bible was published in England. 1535. Before he was even dead. The cause was already moving forward. So his martyrdom was not in vain in that sense, because of course his work continued and was had its huge influence. But the problem that led to his death, him having to flee the country and publish in the Netherlands, was solved before he even died. So it's like a retroactive prayer. That's how powerful Tyndale's prayer was, that God's like, I know you're going to make that prayer in a few months. I got it covered already. Pretty amazing. This is the first complete English language Bible because, of course, Tyndale's Old Testament wasn't finished when he was killed. It was legally published by the approval of Henry VIII. Why? Because Anne Boleyn was a supporter of Miles Coverdale. So after he chucked out Catherine, he was on Anne Boleyn, right? And Miles Coverdale was friends with Anne Boleyn. If you know anything about the story of Henry VIII, you know that this is going to be a short friendship, right? Poor Anne. Unfortunately, in 1536, a year after this was published, Anne Boleyn was executed. Same problem. Now, if you know anything about human anatomy, after 4 or 5 wives, you're saying, hey, Henry, it is not the women's fault, dude. It's you. You're the one with a problem. Actually, it's a very tragic story. There were a lot of miscarriages, a lot of children that died at like age 2. But happened a lot back then, right? They just couldn't get a son, and the man was obsessed with having a son. He actually had some amazing daughters. He should have just been happy with them. So after she was executed, yeah, it's not so important. But this was that next step that was legally published in England. He utilized Tyndale for his Old Testament or for his New Testament. He did his Old Testament work on his own using Luther's German and Jerome's Vulgate because Miles Coverdale couldn't read Hebrew. So he said, well, what do I know Greek, I can handle the New Testament, but what can I do for the Old Testament? He used Latin and German. Not the best, but a step in the right direction. Unfortunately, under Queen Mary, he was shown the door. So Coverdale went from being like the king's buddy to being on the out to having to flee the country. This is the way things kind of went back then. We're going to go through these editions fairly quickly so that we can finish up today with the King James Bible, perhaps, if we get that far. The Matthew Bible came out the next year, was edited by John Rogers under the pseudonym Thomas Matthew. John Rogers was no dope. He said, Miles Coverdale is on the out, Tyndale's dead. I'm not going to put my name on this thing. I'll put that so they can chase Thomas Matthew around. Good luck catching Thomas Matthew. He's not real. All right? Nice generic name, right? How many different Thomas Matthews were like, dude, I'm not the guy. It wasn't me. It was an edited version of Tyndale. All right? He used Coverdale, and Coverdale used Tyndale. For the missing Old Testament sections, he used Coverdale. But other than that, it was just Tyndale. It was authorized by Henry VIII. This is the first one that was officially authorized. Coverdale's was permitted. This one was authorized. I mean, if you want to quibble about that. But it's 1 year after Tyndale's death when his dying prayer was to open the eyes of the King of England. So the same Bible that was confiscated and publicly burned a couple years ago is now being published legally with the King's blessing. 180. Right? And just a couple of years. And it's still Tyndale's words, right? They didn't change it to make it so that it could be legal. It's still Tyndale. It was illegal then, now it's fine. It's just one of those things. Kind of like prohibition, right? All of a sudden it's illegal, and everything changes. Now, one of the things that he had were notes in the margin. You see one there, one little one there. Notes in the margin that some officials of the church said, those are kind of controversial notes, buddy. Which is probably why he put Thomas Matthew's name on there, because he wanted to have those notes in there. That didn't get him into trouble, but in 1553, his preaching did. His public preaching. Couldn't really blame that on someone else, right? He was arrested for sedition by bloody Queen Mary in 1555. He was burned at the stake, the first martyr under her reign. So even though he put somebody else's name on his Bible for his preaching, he was burned at the stake. So you win some, you lose some for poor John Rogers. It didn't work out. But once again, it's just another edition of Tyndale. Nothing is changing. Nobody is doing the ground work from the ground up. They're just taking Tyndale, maybe doing a little bit of editing, but it's still Tyndale. After that, we have what's known as the Great Bible. Anybody see why it's called the Great Bible? They're huge. These are public Bibles for the churches. All right. It's also referred to as the chained Bible. The picture on the top shows the Bible being chained to the podium. They actually did that. They chained it to the podium so it wouldn't walk off, so that they could leave it there. All right. This is the work of Miles Coverdale. We just had him a minute ago. He helped put this edition together. He once again heavily relied on Tyndale and Erasmus and also Matthew. So everybody's just building on what the last guy did, right? Which all with the foundation of which is Tyndale. And one of the great things about the Great Bible is that they were put in podiums in the churches and left there. And so what the people did, and we've got a variety of stories that talk about this, and so we know that it happened, just not how much or with a lot of details, is that the people in the town would find somebody who knew how to read, right? It takes a little work. Find somebody who knows how to read, go to the church, and let's all just sit down and listen. And they just would read page after page of the Bible in English, and the people were fascinated because they'd never heard it in English before, because even though these printed editions are so much cheaper than hand copies, they're still not free. All right, it's still a significant investment for poor people. But the law now said that every church had to have a public Bible. This is the cover page from the Great Bible. It's got just some interesting stuff. There's Henry VIII sitting on the throne. If you're going to make a Bible that's officially sanctioned, why not have the king sitting there looking great? You've got the priests on one hand getting the Bible and the lay people on the other. The attitude has shifted dramatically, hasn't it? From all those guys that were saying, we don't want people that are regular getting the Bible. That's finally changed, because now this is literally a public Bible that anybody that can read can walk up to and read. It allowed them to obey the law that was passed in 1538 that said that every church should have a public Bible on display. It's a fascinating law. Every church should have a public Bible on display. And so people came and they listened and they were fascinated to finally hear the Bible in English. And of course, the only problem is finding someone who can read and not, making that poor guy go until his voice is hoarse. After that, this is an important next step. This is the Geneva Bible from 1560, and this is the actual size of a Geneva Bible. Not as pocket small as Tyndale, but still a small, fairly cheap to make copy. Meant to be mass-produced. And why are we calling it the Geneva Bible? Well, because it was printed over in Geneva because of the turmoil that was happening under Bloody Queen Mary. All right? Mary tried to take the country back to the Catholic Church, and it got ugly. A lot of martyrdoms, a lot of blood in the streets kind of stuff, and that didn't last very long. It was a short attempt to change the Anglican Revolution that Henry VIII had started, and during that little time period, people that wanted to print the Bible like this had to do so outside of the country. It was a very brief thing. So we have the Geneva Bible. Now, let's see what we have here. It was published by the Protestant exiles in Geneva, Switzerland during the reign of Queen Mary. It's the first English Bible to contain verse divisions. And you're thinking, thank goodness, now we can actually find something. All right? For 1,500 years, nobody thought to add chapter and verse divisions. It's just one of those things that you're like, well, duh. That makes it so much easier. But it wasn't until until 1560 that in English, the Geneva Bible wasn't the first one to do it. But once someone figured that out, everybody did that because it made everybody's life easier. Now, you know this, right? The verse divisions are not inspired because they didn't come until here. So sometimes they're in a stupid place, right in the middle of a sentence, right? Sometimes they cut a thought in half. And the worst thing you can do then is to make an internet meme that is based upon where the verse ends and stops Paul from finishing his thought and say, see, bam, there's a verse and that's the theology and I don't care what came before it and I don't care what came after it. I don't care about the context. So that's the downside of verse divisions, is it's convinced some people that they're independent units, that they're like Pez, that you can dispense them one verse at a time, when in reality, of course, that's not the way the Bible is supposed to be interpreted. All right, that was my soapbox. I'll get back off. The Geneva Bible also uses the Latin typeset. We're finally getting to the point where the letters look like the letters that we recognize today. No more of those weird F's for S's, right? That made us try to figure out what on earth they were doing with the word beginning. None of that nonsense. So it finally starts to look like modern English type. We've got verse division. So this is the first Bible that looks like a Bible that you would recognize. Not only can you read it pretty fairly easily, but the verse divisions and the typesetting. Now you're looking at this one and saying, what is all of this? This is the text. You see that? And here's the text. And here's a little bit of text. What on earth is all of this around the sides? Anybody know? Notes. It is the first study Bible. Those are very Calvinist, Reformed theology notes, because this was published in Geneva under the influence of John Calvin and Theodore Beza and the giants of the Reformed movement of that part of the Reformation, not Martin Luther, but the further Reformed groups. So they put a bunch of notes that explained what the verses meant. All right? This is the Bible of William Shakespeare. Shakespeare quotes more than one edition, but more often than not, and Shakespeare quotes the Bible all the time, in case you're wondering. He quotes the Bible all over the place. The man knew his Bible. He's quoting the Geneva Bible most of the time. All right? This is also the Bible of those people you probably heard about, the Puritans. When they came to America, they had a Geneva Bible tucked under their arm. All right? That was the Bible they liked because that's pretty close to their theology too. And so they believed in predestination and all that kind of stuff. And so very much so. And so they came with the Geneva Bible in hand. The typeface was easy to read. It was the first one with verse divisions. It was endorsed by John Knox. You've heard of him. By John Calvin, by Theodore Beza. All right? These are big Reformed names. King James was not a fan because in some of these margin notes, they kind of hinted at the fact that maybe the divine right of kings is not from the Bible. That God did not ordain every single king and you should shut up and do everything they have to say. A little bit subversive, right? All right? Kings are not a fan of their subjects reading in the margin notes that they have the right to protest against them, that they have the right to disobey laws that are immoral, that kind of thing. Doesn't go over well with a guy that was born the King of England. So James I was not a fan, and that will, of course, lead to what we know later, right, about King James. And so he's not a fan of the Geneva Bible. Let me give you an example of one of the notes. All right, in Ephesians, one of the notes says that Paul assureth the Galatians of salvation because they were thereunto predestined by the free election of God before they were born and sealed up to this eternal life by the Holy Ghost. That's a margin note, right? It's a Calvinist margin note. Nothing wrong with that, but you know what perspective that's coming from, and that's what was in the sides there. It is, once again, affordable for the common man because it's smaller, it's cheaper, it's more accessible. So it's going to have great success. What else about the Geneva Bible? It was, as if you didn't see this coming, a revision of William Tyndale. I'm hitting that on the head every single time. William Whittingham was the one that did the work. John Calvin, John Knox, Theodore Beza helped. All of those study notes in the margin. As I said, Shakespeare, the Puritans. And next to Tyndale, it's the second most influential translation on the King James. It sold more copies in England than the King James until 1642. It took 30 years for the King James Bible to be more popular than the Geneva. Everybody loved the Geneva Bible, everybody but King James, and other people that were on his side of politics. It was a well-loved, it was a great translation, it was very useful, but of course those margin notes are controversial. And this is the start of the era of fighting about what we believe in the margin notes. All right? And we've been doing this ever since. We can't help ourselves. We just love the margin notes and talking about what the verse really means. In 1580, just to let you know a little flavor, the Scottish Assembly, everybody loves the Scots, right? The Scottish Assembly required every home to have a Bible, and they passed a law that said the government could search your home to make sure you had one. That probably twists you in knots politically, right? You're like, yes, make sure everybody should have a Bible. Wait a minute, we don't want the government in our home to ensure that. Push-pull there, right? Between the morality you like and the libertarian streak that's in a lot of Protestants. That's a tough combination, but an interesting law for a different time. Not one we're going to want to try to reenact, by the way. That's not the way to get people to love the Word of God, right? It is to say, we're going to fine you if you don't buy it. That kind of thing doesn't work. But that was an interesting choice by the government in Scotland. I don't know how often they knocked on people's doors to say, show me your Bible. But that was a fascinating time. All right, a couple more before we get to the King James. And we're not going to get to, we will start next week with the King James. So we'll finish off with the bishops and the Dewey Reams, then it'll lead us right off to the King James to start next week. The Bishop's Bible in 1568, a team of translators. We're starting to get to the team. We've been talking about individuals, right? Tyndale, Coverdale, Rogers, and Whittingham. They're all one man. Now we're getting to the era where people realize this is just too much for one person. Let's bring a whole bunch of people together. A team of translators under Matthew Parker's leadership, and they left out the margin notes because the Anglican clergy were not a fan, because the Anglican clergy represented the government wasn't a fan, and so they left the margin notes out. It's not much different than the Geneva Bible in its readings, it just doesn't have the margin notes, because it, once again, is using Tyndale, just like all the rest. In 1568, this is of note, in 1568, the first edition said love in 1 Corinthians 13. The greatest of these is love. In 1572, they changed it to the greatest of these is charity. Which one did the King James Bible follow? The original, anyway. Charity, right? But that's just, and that's one of the biggest translational choices, right? What does Paul really mean when he's talking about there? What is the best English word for that? That's just to let you know that they weren't that sure, because they went from one to the other. They changed their mind in between editions. The church liked it, but the people were like, we're good. We got the Geneva Bible. We're fine. This didn't sell a lot of copies. And then lastly, kind of a side step in the discussion, and if you look at your chart, I haven't made reference to the chart much, but next week we will definitely be talking about this chart at the end. You notice that we had Erasmus, which led us to Tyndale, and then the Geneva's Bible and the King James Bible. Those are all in direct descendants of Erasmus. Over here, in the middle of the chart, we've got Dewey Reams. This is not from Erasmus, and there's a great reason for that. So what is the Douay-Rheims Bible? That's in 1582. This is an English Catholic response to the influence of those Geneva Bible margin notes. And so here we have a published edition that is going to have Catholic margin notes to go against the Calvinist margin notes of the Geneva Bible. All right? Everybody's got margin notes, except for the ones that the Anglican Church put out because they don't want any margin notes. But this is their response to that. And it's going to have those. It's translated in France because at this point, these people are now the exiles and can't live openly and practice Catholicism in England. And so therefore, they are in France doing this edition. And it's primarily based upon Jerome's Vulgate. And so the reason I don't put it below Erasmus is because their basis is the Latin. They didn't go back primarily to the Greek. Because the Latin was still being used officially by the church, by the Catholic Church, Jerome's Latin. The church authorized this English translation, but they did it from Jerome. There's a little bit of caveats to that, but that's the basis of it. They also consulted Coverdale and the Geneva's Bible, but primarily, they brought it out of the Latin, not the Greek or the Hebrew. So it's not going to be part of our story in that it's kind of like a cousin, not a direct descendant. The modern Catholic Bible, the New American Bible that came out in 1970, is a direct descendant of this. And so many of the differences, if you have a friend, a family member, whatever, and you're talking about your faith, and you both open up your Bible, and maybe you're reading the New American Standard or the NIV or the New King James, whatever, some of the differences between your translation and their translation are going to be because theirs went Greek to Latin to English, and yours just went Greek to English. And so some words are going to be off a little bit different here, a little bit different there. And of course, that can just, sometimes it leads to confusion and whatnot. But if you ever have that experience and you pick up a Catholic Bible, part of that is because of the heavy influence of the Latin Vulgate still. All right? But to me, the fascinating thing is that now we've got the dueling study notes. All right? You put your notes, we'll put our notes, we'll fight it out in the margins. All right? Fortunately, they're not letting it affect the text. There's no real evidence that either of these, that either the Protestants in Geneva or the Catholics in France are saying, let's change the words of the text to fit our theology. They're not doing that. They're fighting it out in the notes, right? And of course those notes are influential on people. They read them and are influenced by them. All right. Let's stop there and take some time for a few questions, and then next week we will start with the King James Bible. So has anybody got a question over the 1,000 years that we covered in the last 2 hours? If you've got one, now's the time, because by next week you'll forget. Yes. Here you go.
You were saying that
Closer.
William Tyndale was not allowed to publish.
In England, yes.
He had it published in Word.
Right.
Where is that?
I think now it's in Belgium, but back then it was still part of the Holy Roman Empire because the Habsburg kings owned all that land. They owned Spain. They owned the Low Countries, as it was called. So it's in that area.
Is it still
It's still a city, yeah. Most people have never heard of it, but that's okay. It's a weird-sounding town. What you got?
So where did the verse breaks actually originate from? So the Geneva Bible published them, but did they originate those, or did those come from another Greek or something?
All right, brain.
It can be next.
It'll come to me, half an hour from now, and I'll say, oh, that's where it was from. And I'm not off the top of my head 100% sure who it was that was behind that idea. Suddenly I got louder. But And either way, it's a 16th century idea. It's a brilliant idea, but it has absolutely zero divine, authority behind it. 98 times out of 100, they're in decent places, right? The verse divisions. But of course, they weren't originally made in English, the verse divisions. So our word order, our sentence structure is going to mess with that a little bit as well. They were meant, I'll go out on a limb a little bit, but I'm fairly certain they were originally put in German. Lord knows the Germans like everything nice and neat and orderly. Anything else? Questions? Yes? In the back. Of course, all the way to the back. No, you're good.
So I was just curious, with Gutenberg's printing press so close to Columbus, settling America and coming to America, did they use the Jerome's Vulgate during those initial years before the Geneva Bible? Because there was about 60 years difference there. I was just curious what
did who use
the early settlers
to America?
Yeah, I was just curious if they were utilizing that at that time.
Settlers where? Where in America? It's a big continent.
Well, wherever
Spanish settlers, English settlers.
Yeah.
Well, Spanish settlers would have still been using the Jerome's Vulgate. Yes.
Okay.
Because I don't know when the first Spanish vernacular translation was published, because I didn't spend a lot of time on the first French, the first Spanish, the first Dutch, whatever, because the English part of the story is the one that matters to most of us the most, because that's the language we're speaking here. But until that was made, English is and German were more on the forefront of that, because of course, you remember that the Protestant-Catholic divide is almost very neatly north-south, right? Northern Europe is Protestant, Southern Europe is Catholic, and because the church said you couldn't make any new translations without authorization, that's going to be a much slower process. Those crazy Protestants were doing whatever they wanted in the north, right? Whether it's in Sweden or in the Low Countries or in England, their following of that authority is going to be much looser because everything's been changed, and so that has an impact on it as well. But in terms of English settlers, not the Puritans anyway. The first major, they were using the Geneva Bible, and since they're one of the most important permanent settlements, you're not talking about Jamestown or whatever where they're not there anymore. But what else? Anybody else? Yep.
You were talking before about the
Probably
the notes that were on the side of the Geneva Bible. Were they something similar to footnotes that we call them now?
So, for example, let me back it up. Which one? Not Dewey Reams.
Bishop's Bible, whatever it is.
Even the Bishop's Bible is going to have textual notes, like cross-reference notes, that says Romans 8:2 or whatever, so that you know where else to go. Those aren't controversial. Nobody's worried about those, and nobody's worried about grammatical notes, like to help you understand the Hebrew or the Greek. It's the study notes, right? The ones that explain the theology of it that are controversial by the people that don't like whoever put it out. And that, of course, is going to continue to this day. You can get some very different study notes in your Bible depending on who published it and what they have to say about things, how Calvinist they are, how Arminian they are, how Protestant they are, how Catholic they are. They're going to have some very different study notes about the text. But that's not the same thing as textual notes or cross-referencing notes. Those are pretty standard, right? And most people those are going to be about the same in just about any Bible. Anything else? So after 2 weeks, is it more clear or is it muddier than it was before? Are we gaining? We're gaining. Now, all the stuff next week is going to be modern stuff, right? We're starting in 1611 with the King James Bible. Everything else after that is newer. All right? The whole rest of this story is in English. We'll still talk about the Greek and the Hebrew a little bit, but at least you'll be able to read and understand all the stuff that's on the screen. So you got that going for you. So thanks. Yep, you're welcome. Yep, this back. Hey. Go home and read the Gospel by St. Matthew. Gotta love the old-timey spelling, right?